Hi everybody, how's it going? I grew up in a little town in Ohio, north central Ohio on Lake Erie. And when I was growing up there wasn't a lot to do, especially after school as a kid. So we'd go to the library a lot and hang out, and the librarians would constantly tell me to be quiet and shut up. So now when I think that I'm in a library with a microphone in front of me, I'm very satisfied. It's a good place to be. I'm going to talk a little bit about me and then my organization, so you have a little background about where I'm coming from, and then about a particular issue that I think you might be interested in related to abuse and neglect. There's certainly some neglect overlays involving chemical restraints and long-term care settings. Before I do that, though, I like to show pictures of my kids because they're super duper duper cute. That's Cal and Reggie, and they're 2 years old, and they're great, and they're about to have a sister in a couple months. We're pretty excited about that. So I'm going to have 3 kids under the age of 3 at the same time. And one of my friends who's in the audience today said, you're going to have to switch from man-to-man defense to zone defense, which I think is really a good way to put it. So I grew up in Ohio, and then when I got out of school, law school, I went to Las Vegas, and I got a job representing people with alleged mental disabilities in the civil commitment system. And I met a lot of interesting people there. And it was a great job, and I loved it, but I didn't really like living in Las Vegas, so I ended up moving to California and started helping elderly people in a senior citizens legal services program. And I sort of gravitated to the institutional settings of nursing homes because I saw a lot of rights deprivations, more than I care to really get into right now, and was sort of inspired to take on that work. And so then I started focusing exclusively on the enforcement of resident rights in nursing homes, and then moved up to the Bay Area and started working for California Advocates for Nursing Home Reform. CANR's a nonprofit organization. We do 3 things primarily. A lot of stuff about Medi-Cal for long-term care. How do you get on Medi-Cal? How do you deal with share of cost issues? And some of it's community. We inevitably get questions about Medi-Cal for community treatment, but most of our expertise is in nursing home Medi-Cal. And we do a lot with abuse and neglect. We have a lawyer referral service where we connect people to lawyers who might be able to advocate for justice in situations where we have significant abuse or neglect. And then we also talk to people all day long, emails, telephone calls. We have a hotline, a 1-800 number, and we get calls from all over the country. But we focus primarily on California. I got a problem, and we try to help them with that. So then the third thing we do is sort of related to that. It's all about information, getting support for consumers, and that includes both sort of the residents in these facilities and their family members who are trying to get them into a better place. What is long-term care? Everybody's got a different definition. This is sort of mine. We're talking about services and supports that we're expecting for at least 6 months. And for CANR's purposes, location is really the key. We see a lot of the same issues in community settings as we see in institutional settings, but CANR's focused on really the last 2 bullet points there. The RCFE, which is the Residential Care Facility for the Elderly, also known as assisted living, and then in nursing homes. And we have some fact sheets, and we dabble in home-based care, but not too much. Unfortunately, there's a lot of abuse. That's well documented, going back generations of abuse in institutional settings. A tremendous amount of financial abuse. I think it often goes underreported. USA Today did a big series about 8 or 9 months ago on nursing homes where some front office person, management person had taken a lot of resident money, and it was all these different facilities around the country. It looked pretty systemic. So that's happening. And then when I think about neglect, unfortunately, and remember, keep in mind that I only ever hear sad stories. Not too many people call me and tell me that they had a good time and their experience was great and they just wanted me to know about it. But with that in mind, I would say pretty much in most facilities, the issue isn't if there's neglect, it's how much neglect there is. The federal and state regulations are actually pretty good as it relates to nursing homes and what's required. Basically, nursing homes are required to provide all the services necessary for the residents to thrive. But I don't often see that that's the case. So some issues, if you've got an abuse or neglect situation in a long-term care setting, I thought it might be helpful to have some resources. What do? You file a grievance. That's nice. There's also in facilities resident councils where all the residents meet together regularly, maybe once a month, and talk about problems and then try to get them addressed as a group. There's also family councils in a lot of facilities. And then, of course, litigation. And then there's agencies. There's the Ombudsman Program. Benson and Isaac are here. There's the state agencies, which can be helpful in some cases. In other cases, not so much. And then law enforcement. I got the DA, the Attorney General. Then DRC is Disability Rights California, and in Canner. What I'm going to talk about is just one slice of where I see abuse and neglect in institutional care settings. And it's an area where I've been doing a lot of training and discussion and jumping up and down to whoever I think can influence policy, because it's something that I think is it's been overlooked for a long time, and things are starting to change. The environment's changing. Some of the things I heard before about bullying make some sense here in this discussion, because it's all really about our perception. I used to do senior legal services, so I had a million clients who used to say, boy, in the good old days, things were so much better. And I would say, yeah, like you could hit your spouse and not have any problems, or you could drive drunk, and that was no big deal. It's all about how we evolve and what we're going to accept and tolerate. And with bullying, we're seeing increasing consciousness about that. This is so what I'm talking about, I'm also hoping becomes something that, with more awareness, starts to fade away, like smoking in crowded public spaces. I mean, just think, like 30 years ago, that was sort of the norm. And there's been some laws that have helped, push that movement along, but it's also a lot about just stigmatizing what we now consider, pretty bad and unsafe behavior. So the point on the misuse of chemical restraints is that for people with dementia who have oftentimes very confused minds and don't know what's going on, they don't have a lot of short-term memory to rely on. A lot of times they lose language skills, so it's difficult for them to convey what they're feeling and seeing and observing. So behavior becomes key. The doctor said behavior is communication, and that's a bedrock principle of this idea that chemical restraints are oftentimes not necessary for treating people with dementia. And it's really, it's just sort of all based on common sense that when someone with confused thinking is acting in a particular way, they're trying to tell you that something is either good or bad, and it's up to us to figure out what that might be, and if it's something that's bad, to fix it. It's not really rocket science. Just real quick on the use of antipsychotics for people with dementia. This is the DART AD study. This was a long-term study of people with dementia who were given an antipsychotic or a placebo in England. The study was run by a doctor named Clive Ballard. And if you look, you tell people, and it's now FDA required that the labels for antipsychotic drugs tell you that if you're elderly with dementia, it will double your risk of death. And that sounds pretty crazy, but I think when you see the actual numbers, it's even crazier. You've got, after 3 years, if you were elderly with dementia and you were given an antipsychotic, you can expect 30% will still be alive. If they were given a placebo and not an antipsychotic, almost double, 59 will still be alive. That's a dramatic difference, and 3 years isn't all that long. So the problem in nursing homes, it's that staff, physicians are acculturated to thinking of everything as a symptom of disease. So that when you resist care, when you refuse showers, when you strike out at somebody, when you spit out at somebody, when you cry, help me, help me, help me, till 4 in the morning, that's all considered a behavioral symptom of dementia. And what we're trying to do at Canner and a lot of great places all around the country is to change that thinking into, this is the side effect of somebody who has confused thinking and hasn't no other way of expressing themselves. So taking it down to a very human level. Again, hallmarks of dementia: memory loss, confusion, and trouble communicating. When you put those three things together, and now you put that person into a completely strange and foreign environment where you've got potentially hundreds of people around them, all these alarms going off, lots of noise, shift changes, people wheeling in your meals, people taking off your clothes, what do you think is going to happen? If it was any of us who don't have dementia, that would be pretty difficult. That would be a difficult transition to make. Now add the fact that you have trouble speaking, you have trouble remembering, and you don't know who the hell anybody is. I think it would be absurd to not expect that there's going to be some agitation or behaviors. This is a difficult slide because that's by the way, that's my kid Cal. In his first Halloween, we dressed up. He's a Year of the Dragon, so he was a dragon, and he didn't like the costume. But it's real difficult because you don't want to infantilize what elderly people with dementia suffer. They're not babies, and the appropriate response to behavior related to dementia is completely different from how you would respond to a crying baby. But the idea is pretty similar. What I'm trying to teach here is that when you see a crying baby, you don't say, "Oh, that poor baby, they need some sort of drug to take the edge off, and then everything will be fine." What most people identify when they see a crying baby is needs. And the baby is trying to communicate that, "Hey, buddy, I've got needs and they're going unmet." In this case, Cal probably needs just to get the hell out of his dragon costume. But it's often, think about it, it's oftentimes hunger. It might be, I'm lonely, I'm scared, I might have pain, I might have a full diaper. All of these kinds of things show up in long-term care settings. But when we've got somebody who's elderly and has a diagnosis of dementia and not a baby, in nursing homes we think of that as a symptom of a disease and we want to medicate it, rather than just simply providing food, identifying and relieving pain, changing the diaper and making sure that we're keeping the diapers fresh if that's what we need to do. But even more importantly, providing lots of love and attention and socialization, because that does not go away. Those needs do not go away with dementia or with virtually any disability. So what we've been talking about at Canner for a few years now is what we call a least medicating approach. Dr. Evans, who's here, a lot of times he talks about the use of antipsychotics for treatment of dementia as a failure. And it's not that the care providers are failures. It's just to keep in mind that if we've gotten to the point where there's no other treatment available, no other response available than an antipsychotic drug to sedate and subdue the patient, then we've really failed to identify what the problem is and to be able to address it in a non-pharmacologic way. And that happens. We're human, we're not perfect. A lot of times we cannot figure out what the behaviors are. I shouldn't say a lot, but sometimes. But most of the time we can, and if you talk to the right experts and you just start to think about how somebody's acting in human terms instead of medical terms, the answers become pretty self-evident. So behavior is communication. Know who your care recipient is. So many residents end up in nursing homes and nobody on the staff knows a thing about them, what their preferences are, how they like to be treated, what name they like to be used. If you got a resident named Thomas, he was called Tommy his whole life, and now people are calling him Thomas, that might be a little upsetting to somebody, and they can't convey that. Knowing that they were somebody who kept unusual hours and slept during the day and stayed up at night, those kinds of things can be massively important rather than putting somebody down to bed at 7:30 at night. Really important, meet them where they are. With people with dementia, it's critical to not constantly try to correct what might be a mistaken belief, and instead just go with it. And a lot of times that can be sort of fun. Other principles, prophylactic pain management. There's a good study, people after a hip surgery talking about how much pain medication they got. And if for people who didn't have dementia, got twice as much pain medication post-hip surgery as those with dementia. Why do you think that is? Because people with dementia don't experience pain? Hell no. It's because they couldn't tell their doctors, their nurses, hey, this hurts. I'm an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm an 8, and give me something. Instead, they might be, quote, resistant to care or crying for help. Other variables here are changing the environment, making sure the environment is conducive to happiness. It's really what this whole movement is about improving quality of life, making the environment such that people are going to thrive with lots of love and attention. Some of the alternative therapies for, instead of antipsychotics or psych drugs, are simple things like aromatherapy and massages. I mean, the kind of things that make people feel good. Music and memory, that's a big push now. Some of you might be familiar with the film Alive Inside. There was just a screening in San Francisco where they give people iPods loaded with music that they loved when they were growing up. And they play the music, and in some cases the results are miraculous. People just spring to life, and all of a sudden memories are coming back, and they're very communicative. Comfort as the goal of every experience. Dementia is a fatal disease. People with dementia don't get better. They die. So it's not really so much about saving them, but science is making some progress in that area, and hopefully that will happen soon. But it's all about just making people comfortable. There's great trainers out there who are far better on this topic than I am, who talk about when somebody is comfortable, they're not going to hit you. When somebody is comfortable, they're not going to resist care. It's all about reframing the language. Where some people might see resisting care, other people might see self-protection. I don't know who you are. Why are you trying to take off my pants? What are you doing in my bathroom? Whereas other people might see wandering. From a different perspective, you might see seeking, or boredom, or lack of physical activity. So that's all I got. I'm going to... that's Cal and Reggie eating yogurt. That was about a year ago. I got to leave soon, so if there's questions, you better ask them now. Otherwise, you'll have to email me, and I might not ever answer you.
Well, excuse me. I have one question. My father had dementia, infarct or stroke dementia, and one of the phases before he reached the plateau was what's called, in lay terms, the angry phase. I mean, he had punched 2 women out in a restaurant. He came after me with clenched fists saying murder or something. And I think, from one perspective, it is important to recognize that is a normal, if you will, phase of the progression of dementia, at least over the first year or so until it reaches a plateau, and antipsychotics may play a beneficial role. That I don't think that contradicts anything you said, Tony, about just thinking give an antipsychotic for dementia or Alzheimer's, which is a kind of dementia. But certainly I think we need to recognize that there is that phase of anger, impulse control, where someone could really hurt and someone else. Yes, the lady in the pink sweaters, the mic, please.
My question is Alzheimer same thing as dementia?
Oh, yeah.
I have an aunt who has Alzheimer. She passed away last year. So that's why I'm just going to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I should have clarified at the beginning. There's all sorts of forms of dementia. Alzheimer's-related dementia, I think, is the most prevalent, and then you've also got various others. Parkinson's disease is a common cause of dementia. Yeah, and what I'll say is if the care provider does nothing different from what they've always done for somebody with dementia, as the disease progresses, you will get behaviors. It's inevitable. What we're trying to do is teach providers that it ought to be unusual for people to have behaviors. It's not that it's you're a terrible caregiver if it happens, but that if you can anticipate what causes frustration, confusion, or heightens confusion and anger, and get ahead of it and make sure that those conditions don't happen very often, I think you can really get out ahead and limit the amount of behaviors that you confront. But absolutely, if there's health and safety issues and you've gone through your quick checklist of alternatives and somebody might get hurt, then I think you've got to consider pharmacologic interventions.
I have a question for you. You said you work in an institution and all they need is love and to be cared for. Don't you think that if we could provide similar places in smaller home-like settings, it would be a hell of a lot better than institutions? I'm anti-institution. I work for Golden Gate Regional Center, and I believe that more people can thrive when they're in their own homes if the state will pay for people to stay in their own homes and close down these damn hospitals.
Yeah, good question. I think it's easier to have better dementia care in a home-based setting, keeping people where they're comfortable and not having these difficult transitions into completely strange places with lots of strange faces, in addition to the number of people. In nursing homes, there's been a sort of a small-ish movement, no pun intended, for the small institutional setting. There's one called the Greenhouse Project. The Eden Alternative talks a lot about these principles of like smaller 6-bed facilities where they provide nursing home care. California, they're having a pilot project. We'll see how it does. The problem is, of course, with limited funding, there's economies of scale issues, and then also regulatory compliance issues. We have all sorts of regulatory requirements for nursing homes. As they like to say, we're the second or third most regulated industry in the United States, and applying those regulations that protect health and safety to smaller facilities where they might not have the same resources becomes an issue as well. But yeah, absolutely. I think you talk to anybody, even people who work in institutions, they're anti-institutional setting. The problem is our funding structure, at least in California, and I think in a lot of other states, sort of favors that level of care for particular types of populations.
Hi, I wanted to, first of all, thank you for your presentation and just tell you a quick story. My 97-year-old mother is in a nursing home, has been for years, had a stroke, has dementia, started failing, losing weight, so they said, okay, we'll put her on hospice. What happened with hospice? It's the end of the 6 months. They called me today. We're discharging her because she's improved. And the reason she's improved, she's getting better care, higher level of care, more attention, more personal, volunteers coming over, medications changed, tweaked. What I'd like to know is, now that they're planning to discharge her because she no longer meets criteria, and she'll probably, what I'm guessing, will start failing again, and then we'll go back on hospice. What I'm curious about is, how do you deal with the benign neglect that I see in a lot of nursing homes that seems to be endemic, where people, it's easier to medicate them than provide these other alternatives that you talked about. I mean, this happens in schools with kids. They might need something. It's like, okay, let's give them Ritalin instead. It happens with our developmentally disabled who are having behaviors. Instead of addressing it, they look to the meds first. How do we deal with this in the nursing home to try to convince, or is it just a matter of they don't have the money or time or whatever, and so it's easier to over-medicate? So I'm wondering what to do about it.
So I'll respond to that with a quick sort of reflection of my own. With hospice coming in and more services, so then there's some thriving going on. What I see a lot of times in the studies of psych outcomes of elderly people with dementia on psych drugs versus placebos, like the DART study, for example. And you see the people with placebos, sometimes the drugs, there'll be claims that on certain measures that people improve, but they also improve with the placebo. And you wonder, well, how could there be a placebo effect for somebody with advanced dementia? That's probably not what's going on. But what's actually going on, I think, is that the person with placebo is getting a little more attention than they otherwise would have, and being part of the study, and that increases their outcomes. So definitely, just the slightest increases in care and attention can sometimes measure into quality of life outcomes. What do we do about the benign neglect in nursing homes? That's what I'm doing. We have a webpage. It's canner.org and then /stop drugging. We've co-hosted or hosted about 15 dementia care symposia around the state, and we bring in top-notch speakers from around the country to talk about this, mostly with providers, to try to get them to change their thinking and then to start implement the comfort care and least medicating approaches. There's been a lot of policy efforts. The federal government has an initiative to reduce the use of antipsychotics in nursing homes that's resulted in about a 20% reduction nationwide in the last 2 years. So there's some progress. There's a lot that needs to be done. Trust me, I will not lack for a job for several years. But there's some hope here that the message is getting through. Well, that's often the defense that bad facilities throw out there. We can't afford to do these kinds of things because it requires increased staff. That's the conventional wisdom, but it's not true. To make a long story short, what you find out is that with residents who are less dependent on staff to meet their physical needs, you free up staff for other things. And a lot of times when you take them off the sedating drugs, their physical abilities increase. And they can be more partners in care rather than recipients of care.
So I'd like to just sort of cap on what this lady has said. My mother had a traumatic brain injury. She had a fall when she was 90. We thought she was going to die, and so I didn't even know what to plan for. And after 3 weeks, she was discharged to a trauma center in Kentfield. Probably everybody knows about it. She had really good care there, and then she went to a nursing home, and then the care declined. But we spent every day driving to Santa Fe from San Francisco. I did all 3 bridges for like 5 months. And mostly me, but my sister helped. And then I took her home, and the money ran out in the little cottage she had behind our house. And I had 24-hour-a-day caregivers. And every day, as soon as I came home from work, I was out there every night checking and everything. But, of course, if I didn't check, they do anything. I would come home a few times late. The caregiver would have the front door open because she'd had the heater blasting because my mom would go to sleep. And when I started getting up, the money was running out, I was getting pissed off at the caregiver agencies. I found what was supposed to be the best assisted living in San Francisco. And I was lucky my mom got to be up on the floor where most of the people were. But I found that the owner of the home, everything that the residents complained about, by the way, they referred to themselves as inmates, not residents. So they weren't as demented as he was running around saying. If they had complaints about the food, he didn't care. If they had complaints that, if I tried to bring issues to the owner, he didn't want to hear it. He'd say, they've all got dementia, Paula, they've all got dementia, and he'd whisper this. Well, they probably did have it at various, to various degrees, but a lot of them knew what was going on. They had a good activities manager, but she had very little budget. When I first came in, they were supposed to be taking bus trips once a month. Well, it turned out they had just a little bus, so they promised so much to get you in there. You know all that, I'm sure. And, but what I saw was, number one, they pass a lot off to dementia so that they don't have to, worry about them or try to pay more attention. And the other thing is, I think it's really about, and I think you alluded to this, stimulation. It's really, my mother, when she moved from the little cottage, and I wanted to get her in a social situation because she'd always been very social. She used to go to the Y at Stonestown 5 days a week for water aerobics until the day she fell going up to Laguna Honda, and when she was getting off the bus up there. But anyway, it's all about, I think it's really a lot of lack of stimulation. And what the question I'd like to ask is, at one point I was going to try to offer to bring somebody in to sing or to do something, but I was told because his was a for-profit assisted living, we couldn't do it. So he would have to pay the people, and he wasn't going to pay them anything. He wouldn't pay anything for anybody extra to come in. So I would just see the people sit. I mean, the day revolved around getting up, and then they'd get maybe a little snack, and then they'd go to lunch, and then they'd go to dinner, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then they'd hang around and watch TV. And the activities person tried to do as much as she could. But if you don't have stimulation, of course the people are going to fade.
Yeah.
So, that's something. Is there any way of getting communities more involved, where more volunteers at least, could maybe, so many people had nobody visiting them. Oh, and these inmates, by the way, who supposedly all had dementia, used to say to me and my sister, your mom gets such good care, but it's because you guys are here every single day, every day, for 5 years. So, no, she died 2 years ago in September.
Well, I want to be respectful of the other speakers' time, so how are we doing there? How many more speakers do we have?
Quite a few more.
Yeah.
Stephen, I think this Vince is next there, and then we can get to you up.
I want to say there's a commonality in many of the speakers, is that behaviors are a form of communication, but that no matter what setting, it's easier to see the behaviors as a problem. Because when I first started doing this work, before I was an ombudsman up in Lake County, I worked in independent living with regional center clients. And I learned to do task analysis in independent living, and that the more individuals deviate from some quasi-norm in society, the more they have to prove to be normal than to be themselves. And I never forgot that kind of lesson, no matter what work I've been doing subsequently, is that individuals who have dementia, individuals who are autistic, they are not allowed to be themselves, but have to conform to some normative pattern by many professionals, teachers, even family members. And behaviors are an alternative form of communication. It's up to a nursing home, it's up to an assisted living facility, it's up to people living in the home to understand what the person is saying through those behaviors rather than to try to contain those behaviors. Even this morning's NPR story about prisoners in corrections who are mentally ill, the advocates are now talking about isolation and keeping people away who are mentally ill instead of listening to them. If there's any one common theme today, it's that victims of abuse must be listened to with respect no matter where they're living, and that to contain behaviors which may result from that abuse or may result from an institution. I mean, just think about it. If you're demented, how weird it is to live with a bunch of people in a nursing home. Why do we assume that's normal? Of course, individuals with dementia who are shoved in an assisted living facility or a nursing home are not going to enjoy living together. That requires a whole bunch of adjustments that individuals like us would have a hard time learning, let alone people with dementia. So institutions are not any good. Assisted living are not any good because it forces people to live together through some disability, and it never becomes person-centered.
Yes. The question that I have is comes back to the question earlier, is that how I was in a nursing home, and it comes back to the rating systems. How do we get people in the staff in the nursing homes to accept that they have to be more tuned to people with disabilities like me who might temporarily or permanently live there. I mean, I have the little small bathroom, but they liked when Mom and my attendant were there because they didn't have to take care of me. They got used to me going to the public bathroom in their hall, but they don't really have disabled accessible facilities in the room itself. So that's a question we need to work on.
I could give a lot of different responses. Rating systems are problematic because it's so hard to capture what is good care and what is bad care with some sort of algorithm. But if you ask people in the know, like the ombudsman programs, for example, they can tell you what places are good and what places are bad. I think there's lots of reasons why we have generally poor care in nursing homes and why so many people, virtually everybody, wants to avoid a nursing home placement. But generally, it all comes down to, as it does in everything in life, priorities. And we as a society have just not prioritized long-term care in America. And it's totally expected. It's a vulnerable population, an often silent population, we're talking about abuse and neglect. Why? Because of the vulnerabilities. And those same vulnerabilities lead to lack of lobbying power in Washington and in Sacramento and all of those things. And that's why we have to do what we do, which is be loud and proud and advocate and push for better care and higher standards, and that we become priorities rather than just sort of secondary considerations.
Now we're going to hear from Paul Buchanan, who is a social worker with San Mateo Adult Protective Services.
I've worked in case management with Adult Protective Services, and currently I work on what's called the TIES line, which is the entry point for services for adults in San Mateo County. I work also as an urgent response social worker, which means that if there's anything that needs to be done within 3 days, then I'm likely to be the one who will do it. When a report comes to Adult Protective Services, it comes in usually 3 ways. Either by a phone call, in writing, either by an email or a letter, or people come to our office to make reports. The reports are confidential. We are forbidden by state law to reveal who makes the call to us in any circumstance. And the calls could be anonymous. We've had calls where even the name of the victim was anonymous, but we got an address. We will go out to that address and see if we can figure out who it is. So when the call comes to us, we also will do a lot of consultation with people. We encourage people to call, because the work we do is not black and white. It's very gray. And we encourage people to call and talk about the situations with us to determine what might be the best approach for that situation. These are among the activities that Adult Protective Services engages on. One of the first things we try to do is set up a safe place to do the initial assessment. We like to try to create a neutral setting for the victim to be able to talk as freely as possible about what's going on in their lives and around the specific allegations. I will meet people at their work sites, at their schools, but I've also met them in parks, in churches, in restaurants, at our office, kind of anywhere we can meet where they feel like they can freely talk about what's going on. That's really critical. Every report of physical or financial abuse with evidence is cross-reported to the police by Adult Protective Services. We also get cross-reports from the police. So you really have 2 avenues for making a report, either through Adult Protective Services or through local law enforcement. Oftentimes, if we think we're walking into a dangerous situation, we will invite the police to go with us. And most of the 23 different police forces in San Mateo County are very obliging about going with us into a situation. One of the first things we consider are options to protect assets and to protect the individual as well. One of the things we like to do, particularly in a physical abuse or a neglect situation, is determine what would be a safe plan for them if the situation started getting worse. So we look at, are there other places they can go? We work with collaterals to develop a safe plan. If it's a case manager working in GGRC, for example, we will talk about, are there other places that this individual can go while we conduct the investigation? Or do there have to be adjustments within the home setting to make the place safer? These are things we look at. We collaborate with collateral players, including the suspected abuser, because as I said, a lot of these situations are not black and white. And as it's been mentioned many times, punishment doesn't really solve the problem in a lot of situations. what there has to be, and the suspected abuser has a point of view as well. And so it's important to consult and consider all the points of view in this thing to come up with a safe plan. We provide, generally adult protective services will provide up to 3 months of intensive case management. Now, if the individual has a case manager already through a program, then we will simply work with that case manager. And if the case manager is addressing the issues that are leading to the abuse, then a lot of times adult protective services will focus primarily on the abuse allegation itself. And in the back of our minds, in terms of responding to situations, we always are thinking of the need for conservatorship. Is that an option? Because in San Mateo County, the public guardian and adult protective services operates under the same roof. So we do a lot of collaborating together. And we're always in the back of our mind, what else has to happen to make sure this person is ultimately safe in the situation they are? This subject of dependent adult is a very controversial sort of subject. It's very easy to define an elder in California. An elder is anybody over 65, according to the Welfare and Institutions Code. But the definition of a dependent adult is much more complicated. And as you can see, the Welfare and Institutions Code has a huge kind of definition of dependent adult. On a functional basis, what we look at is this individual, would this individual, if given the financial wherewithal, be able to live by themselves? Are they able to conduct their activities of daily living? Are they able to manage their money? Are they able to get to places on their own, whether it's public transportation or otherwise? So when we talk about the criteria for adult protective services, we're talking about people over 65 and people between 18 and 64 who are dependent adults. They depend on another adult for an activity of daily living and their ability to live. Types of adult abuse that we're talking about. Physical abuse, which includes sexual abuse, chemical restraint, physical restraint. We've known of individuals who have had tethers tied on them to keep them from wandering too far. Also, over-medication is a form of physical abuse. Neglect. Neglect is when there's a designated caregiver who is not providing the care they're supposed to do, like hygiene, food, clothing, shelter, making sure they get to medical appointments, making sure they take the medication they need to, that sort of thing. Financial abuse, we also look into for both elders and dependent adults. And in the form for dependent adult, it often means there's a representative payee who is using money for the dependent adult in ways that are not appropriate, and maybe for the repayee's needs rather than the dependent adult's needs. Abandonment, that's when an individual who relies on somebody to take care of them is abandoned, is left alone. Sometimes it's in a hospital, but we've also had individuals abandoned on street corners. Isolation is where a dependent adult is not allowed to have contact with the people they love and the people that they want to have contact with. They're kept from seeing people that the caregiver doesn't want them to see. Abduction is actually, by state law, is when an individual is taken out of the state and not allowed to return. Other treatment with resulting physical harm or pain or mental suffering. In the press, there's a lot of information and stories about physical abuse and financial abuse. They tend to get the most sort of romantic attention. But by far, the most common type of case that we run across for both elderly and dependent adults is self-neglect. These are people who are generally living on their own and their needs are not being met in one way one way or another. We also deal with a lot of hoarders under this category. In fact, it's my belief you can go to any block in any town and find at least one hoarder. There's no question in my mind. About 6 years ago, I did a little study of the Department of Social Services. They have a website or a page called SOC 342, which tracks reports to Adult Protective Services in the 58 counties of California. And so I did a little study between the months of April and June of 2008, when there was 9,750 cases reported to Adult Protective Services throughout the state. And percentage-wise, the most common type of abuse among dependent adults was physical abuse. The next was psychological, or what we refer to as verbal or emotional abuse. Now, the thing about verbal abuse is it is not a mandated report. Mandated reporters are not required to make a report about verbal abuse. They can, in fact, anybody can. But it's not a mandated report, and frankly, a lot of law enforcement and district attorneys are not going to spend a lot of time prosecuting a verbal abuse report. So one of the things we have a discussion with people who make a report of verbal abuse is whether or not an intervention by Adult Protective Services will make the situation worse. Because we cannot be there 24 hours a day, and we don't know what's going to happen if we suddenly show up one day in a home and you know, there's a confrontation with the abuser, but then we leave and we're not sure what's going to happen after that. So we like to be sort of judicious with our verbal abuse investigations. We like to make sure when the referent calls that this is something that the victim is on board with and that is willing to work on this situation. When Adult Protective Services started as an institution about 20 years ago, there was a lot of confusion among all kinds of people, including law enforcement, about whether or not we were sort of an adjunct of Child Protective Services. I used to get that question a lot when I began. This is one of the biggest differences between Child Protective Services and Adult Protective Services. Adults have a right to refuse, no matter how insightful I might be, or no matter how brilliant my ideas might be, they have a right to refuse the services. And that's one of the reasons why we go to the victim first and interview the victim first, because we want to find out what they are ready to do about the situation. In a lot of verbal abuse situations or other kinds of neglect, what they have to consider is what do they have as alternatives. And for a lot of people, there aren't that many alternatives to what they have because of financial constraints. So we really honor that. The feeling is to try to compel somebody to make changes in their life before they're ready to do that is another form of abuse. We'd like to try to avoid that. Now, I know there are a couple gentlemen from the Ombudsman here, maybe you can speak to this too, but there is a difference between Adult Protective Services and the Ombudsman in that the Adult Protective Services will investigate situations in private homes and in daycare centers. However, the Ombudsman will investigate situations in skilled nursing facilities, residential care homes, assisted living, and intermediate facilities. And that's the number for the Ombudsman in San Mateo County. I don't know whether the gentlemen want to give out their number at some point. But if you called that number, they could refer you to the counties in the area as well. And we do actually a lot of collaboration with the Ombudsman because people often start in a skilled nursing facility or a residential care home, but they graduate home, and a lot of the same issues may pervade. So we do a lot of collaboration with the Ombudsman. I want to switch down to our number real quick. Oh, here it is. That's the number in San Mateo County for Adult Protective Services. 1-800-675-TIES, which is 8437. you could actually call that number if you're from another county, and we will direct you to the Adult Protective Services in that county. Any questions or comments?
Paul, I have a question. When, when the reports are made at the state level, whether it's Department of Social Services or Department of Healthcare Services, besides keeping track of statistics, what do these agencies do? I mean, with the reports, in addition to just tabulating reports, what specific actions do they take in terms of corrective or what effects on the state legislator do these agencies have?
There are committees that are made up of Adult Protective Services directors and program managers from all the counties that come together. There's a legislative advocacy committee that tries to work on various issues that affect adult protective services. And they use a lot of statistics that are collected by the Department of Social Services to try to back up these advocacies. So there are committees that exist within Adult Protective Services on a statewide level that try to address some of these problems.
So then the reporting requirements, would you say are important because in the end they're very useful, or in the way you just said, because there are committees that look at them and it may end up to legislative changes and perhaps more funding in certain areas?
Yes.
Of oversight?
Yes. Right. That's what the different advocacy groups within Adult Protective Services are trying to push for. So, and clearly, if you work with government at all, if you don't have statistics, you're not going to go anywhere with any kind of advocacy. So they use that a lot. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Yes, the lady in the very back.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I have a question about, I'm sure it happens quite a lot, but what happens when you go out to maybe a home where you want to talk about allegations of abuse with someone and you truly feel like they're being coerced? So I realize that you said that you do respect the agency of the person to make the decision of whether or not they're ready to make changes. But under circumstances like that, what is the policy? What do you do with that?
Well, again, one of the first things we try to do is create a place where we can meet with the person away from the home, if we can, or away from any kind of coercion. Now, that's no guarantee that they're not going to feel coerced, because they know they're going to have to return to that home. But in certain circumstances, when there's a serious danger, we can also bring them into emergency shelter. We have ways of taking people out of the home, if they agree to it, and putting them somewhere else where they'll feel safe until we can find some sort of solution for the situation. So we do whatever we can to try to avert that coercion that they're feeling at home.
I'm sorry, just to kind of piggyback on that. So when you said emergency shelter, are we talking like nursing facilities, or are we talking like a shelter, like a domestic violence shelter?
It could be a domestic violence shelter. It could be a motel. It could be, we have a facility in Millbrae that we can use as a residential care home on an emergency basis. We contract with other residential care homes where we can have people stay at least temporarily until another solution is. So there are various things we can do to try to protect them and to get them out of that coercive environment.
We're going to hear from Meredith Hardesty, who has lived experience with the topic that we're discussing this afternoon.
So I'm obviously towards the end. So I want to speak on more of staff and facilities using authority figures as a shield. So I've had experience with authority figures being aggressive, where I feel like the staff didn't want to deal with me, so they would put the police involved in enforcing themselves into a situation, and I felt like it would just get worse. And using aggressive force and making the situation worse. And yeah, I don't really know where to go with this, but yeah.
Well, have you experienced, most of us aren't familiar about your personal, experience with any kind of abuse or neglect, or has anything as a result of aggressive staffing and police intervention, has anything resulted in terms of any kind of abuse? Physical or verbal or sexual or any other kind of abuse that you suffered as a result?
Well, back in the day, I would have issues with being violent towards males, and they would use the sheriffs in riot gear to come in and force themselves in to medicate.
And obviously the medication was involuntary. In other words, you did not consent to the medication. Is that right?
No.
And did you understand that there was some determination by a psychiatrist who determined that you were either a danger to yourself or to other people?
Well, I felt that there was a lot of misdiagnosis, and to the factor, I've had diagnosis of psychotic, being schizophrenic, and then obviously that's not true, but yeah.
So you believe that they involuntarily gave you antipsychotic medications, but you're not aware that there was any determination made that you were a danger either to yourself or to others, or that you were so gravely disabled that you couldn't really care for yourself in terms of just basic activities of daily living like hygiene or showers or feeding or that kind of stuff? Or might that have been part of what was going on, or do you not recall?
I don't recall.
Okay. Let me say the issue of involuntary medication has been a long thought issue. There was no court guidance back in the late 70s and early 80s when someone was in the psych ward. Years ago, I used to work for OCR at Health and Human Services, and I remember being at Highland Hospital interviewing the head of the psych department there about that very issue. And it was just very unclear what rights they had. Since then, of course, there's been court opinions, and apparently in most jurisdictions, there is a right to reject involuntary medications unless a determination is made that an individual is a danger to themselves or others, and only used to that extent.
The issue with that is some facilities, they would instigate you with, like, let's say you have issues with males. They would bring in aggressive security guards, and they would speak to you like they'd call you ugly and stupid and fat or whatever, and then you're going to get mad because they've done this before, and you're going to escalate.
So they were the very people who may have caused the problem to begin with, is what you're saying. And that issue, we talked about this here briefly before in psych emergency. They're not permitted sometimes even to call family relatives, but that it's an analogy. It's not your situation, but the rationale for not calling and letting in, well, maybe it's, I don't know about the person's physician, not letting them in, But that person, like a sibling or someone, may be the very person that is the reason that person is in psych emergency. So there's really different ways to look at some of those rules in terms of respecting privacy and if someone doesn't give consent. I mean, there's all kinds of positions around those discussions, which in some ways are similar to what you're saying. I mean, the very people they bring into, I guess in the name of helping and protecting you, are the people who are exacerbating the situation. Those aggressive sheriffs and others they brought in. It is an interesting phenomenon that goes on in the mental health and in psych emergency and in other situations about calling, let's just call the immediate family, and that again, it's not unusual for someone in that immediate family to be the reason why the person's there to begin with. So it does take, there are different sides to that issue. Okay, thank you very much.
I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you think would have helped that situation, looking back, that would have made the situation better for you?
Not bringing in the security and riot gear and forcing their way in with a shield.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing your experiences.
How common of an experience do you think this is? Do you think it happens a lot more often than you think?
I would say yes.
Dr. Kripke earlier and also Dr. Leventhal were talking about behavior form is a means of, my mic isn't working, communication. And Meredith, I know in speaking with you, you had an experience where you communicated that something had occurred and were not believed, which is something else that is apparent with these types of situations. Not everyone that tries to communicate abuse is believed, and then that led to you acting or behaving in other ways to get your point or that communication across to those people. Is that correct?
Yes. They had, at 18, they put me in a level 14 in Marin County and was assaulted. And the staff told me, "You're lying, just go to your room." And I acted out and got brought to San Francisco and then continued on. And it did come out with investigation that it was true with evidence.
Well, what's interesting is one of the reasons they say disabled people are more likely to be abused than non-disabled people, or some of the reasons are they will not be believed, they will not be able to communicate in sufficient detail to, at least from an evidentiary point of view, to be a witness against the perpetrator. I mean, these are general principles to try to explain why are developmentally and/or mentally, etc., individuals 3 times as likely to be abused than non-disabled people. And that, what you said, seems to be an example of one of the rationales that is generally accepted. I don't know which studies that's based on, but certainly when you read about the reasons for more abuse against a disabled individual than a non-disabled. So thanks for sharing. Well, what I'm going to talk about is representative payees, especially with regard to the Social Security Administration and some ethical rules about the payee's responsibility to keep a segregated account. Now, Social Security beneficiaries, these are people who are found disabled and at times are required to have a representative payee. In other words, their monthly beneficiary check will go to the payee, who will pay rent, utilities, and other things, and parse out the rest of the check to the SSI and or SSDI beneficiary. And I looked over the weekend at the regulations, and they're about 10 times as long and much more convoluted than they used to be. But I think the bottom line still exists. A determination if someone is too incapacitated to manage funds is a medical determination. Although Social Security basically took that out and they used the phrase substantial harm to the beneficiary, and Social Security has a lot of discretion, and then they have 20 pages of regulations of all sorts of bureaucratic stuff. But there's the individual payee, which could be anyone 18 or older with no record of a felony. Other factors may make it easier. A family member, someone geographically close to the Social Security beneficiary, are more likely to become a payee. The payee has to sign lots of forms recognizing that they have responsibilities and that they may have liability. There are institutional payees, which are defined as either nonprofits, 501(c)(3)s, they could be lawyers, they could be places that are affording treatment or where the individual, the Social Security beneficiary, is residing. And in order for them to get paid, and unlike individual beneficiaries, they can get paid, instead of just capping at $50 per month per beneficiary, they have to submit what's called a fee petition for representative payee. Not every month, but for each one, so long as there's at least 15 beneficiaries for whom they are getting the monthly Social Security checks for. Now, the accounts always have to be segregated. I mean, there are sort of strict rules on that, and they make sense. They shouldn't commingle money and just mix it up with general funds. So it's absolutely required that these accounts be segregated. A lawyer could do it, I mean, if they're really into that business. I know I'm asked to do it, but we just can't do everything at People with Disabilities Foundation. I mean, we need a lot of bookkeepers, certainly. But issues come up. First of all, a lot of people don't want a payee, and that's very, very common. We get people coming in all the time, how do I get rid of the payee? I don't want the payee. And there's a combination of factors to answer that question. Now that Social Security has made it more complicated. And the best way to do it, in general, what I advise people is, it is a medical decision. You're either too incapacitated. Social Security says physically or mentally, and I'm never sure what they mean by physically. But it is in the newer version of the regulations. Incapacitated, so physically incapacitated. I'm not going to guess what that means, but that's what it says, physically or mentally. So the best letter to get on this is from a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, certifying that they've known the patient for ever long or are the treating source for the patient, and that the person is indeed able to manage his or her funds. Now, when you get into addictions, whether it be drugs or alcohol, it could be gambling and smoking and other things. Then that, especially with drugs and alcohol, they take a harder line approach to sometimes requiring a rep payee, unless, again, it's not 100%, but if you can get a psychiatrist to say that although this person has been spending money on a lot of alcohol and drugs for the past 15 years, they've been clean and sober for the last couple, and they are now in a position, change circumstances, to not be required to have a rep payee. and that will work. There are people who switch back and forth. I mean, in the beginning, when they're first put on benefits, the medical evaluator, it could be a judge, will make a determination, and that is a medical one, that they are too incapacitated to manage their own funds. And it's not unusual for, and I usually tell them, well, don't fight it now. Get your retroactive. Get the check started, and then go into the Social Security office. Of course, there's going to be a form for that. There's a form for everything. So the form to change payees and make yourself payee, it's important to bring in a doctor's letter. Very important, because if they already have a medical determination the other way, it's going to be very hard to go in without new medical evidence, especially from a doctor who knows the patient. Now, with payees, it does lead to financial abuse, in that you get the people who are skimmers, and some, I'm meaning off the benefit check. I mean, they'll pay the person's rent, or maybe they'll pocket an extra $100 for miscellaneous, I don't know what. So in other words, there should be receipts. They have to have receipts for utilities, for rent. And if the landlord's the payee, which is allowed sometimes, even though it sounds like a conflict, it is not always a conflict. A creditor usually should not be a payee, but there are circumstances, and there are the regulations, where they will allow a creditor to be the payee. I mean, maybe there's nobody else, and the fact that it's a creditor for enumerated reasons is not going to cause substantial harm, and those are regulatory words, Social Security regulations, to the individual. And then you get situations where the check's been stolen. And then it's an issue of, first, is it an individual rep payee or an institutional one who manage lots of people's benefits? And there's a big difference between how that's handled, and it doesn't seem fair, well, because it isn't fair, in that the institutional rep payee, if there's stolen checks, the Social Security Administration will reimburse immediately without those people having to wait. Now, if it's an individual payee, they're going to have to fill out a form. Well, everybody always fills out forms with Social Security. That goes without saying. But they're going to have to fill out a form. It's going to be sent to OIG, Office of Inspector General in Baltimore, and they may have to wait 2 years. They are not going to get their check replaced. So that is one big difference between having an institutional payee who can get authorization to charge a monthly fee, and it's much more complicated. It used to be up to $50. Now they eliminated that, and the fee petition for a rep payee really is based on exactly what they do, like how many bills do they pay. I mean, maybe there's a payment plan with a dentist, and other issues. We've had people come and say, well, their sister doesn't give them the money for over 24 hours. And frankly, in a situation like that, the sister being the payee, that is, we really have to, and part of the role of the lawyer is to be objective. 24 hours is not too long to have to wait, and it's a waste of time if that's the reason to get rid of the payee. So we have other situations where the treating psychotherapist and psychiatrist have decided that their patient is spending so much money for cigarettes, and maybe I'll throw in, because I know of one where it was really gambling too, that they told another county employee, the Office of the Public Guardian, to be the payee. Now, what happened there was that it created a terrible conflict of interest because the patient, a disabled beneficiary, was very angry at the 4 to 7 days it took to get the funds from the public guardian, and it was his own psychotherapist and psychiatrist who were making this happen. So he not only wanted to get rid of the public guardian, but it ruined the patient psychotherapist relationship. And they finally, I was representing the claimant, agreed. That is, the psychotherapist and psychiatrist agreed. It was a conflict of interest. And they really, he was trying to get rid of the public guardian, get another payee, and get rid of the psychotherapist of 9 years who he had worked so well with. Because of that. I mean, that's just another element to some of these disputes, and there are a lot of disputes with rep payees. And I guess in all and in summary, there are a lot of rules like segregated accounts, and if the payee does something wrong, people wonder, why do they want to recoup money like an overpayment out of the disabled beneficiary's Social Security money if it was the payee who's responsible for mismanaging. For example, they can't let resources go over $2,000. And if you have, it could be a well-intended parent or anybody where accidentally, so to speak, it goes up to $2,025 a month. I've had parents come in and say, well, it's 2 years, 24 months of benefits they have to pay back, and they try to take it out of the disabled child's account. Now, that should not be happening, and Social Security should not be going after the beneficiary, and eventually they should waive that amount and not even get to the waiver, find the person is without fault if it was really the payee's fault in managing the money, because it's a segregated account. But on SSI, you cannot have over $2,000 in the bank account. And it doesn't matter if it's life insurance, if it's just cash, if it's whatever it is, it can't be over $2,000. So there are all kinds of variations of this issue, but in California, the attorneys have to abide by the rules of professional conduct. Basically, always segregate accounts, and there is the client fund account. They should never, ever put the Social Security disability check into their operating account. That is a very serious violation. They must provide statements, and they must have receipts. Any payee should, but an attorney could jeopardize his or her license to practice law by not following these rules. So this whole area is an area where there sometimes are at least a lot of aggregations of financial abuse, and the payee often, not all the time, but is guilty of it. I mean, you hear stories where maybe the rent's always been $200, and they decide you're going to take $400 because they're maybe using something else in the house or eating more food, or they come up with some reason why they're going to take more and more of the check, or sometimes the whole check, and not leave much spending money for the person on either SSI and or SSDI, the non-poverty program. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Well, just be aware that the public guardian and representative payees and Social Security and conservators and or guardians really have strict fiduciary obligations to do an accounting, to have receipts, to be able to balance things out. It's not that simple. Just ask your friend, you know, or a relative, or just a kind seeming stranger to help you out and get the checks, thinking it'll just be turned over properly. All kinds of issues spring out